We talked to Alex Anthopoulos last night, and he told us this team is not afraid to go over the CBT for a third consecutive season. Yes, welcome on in to Braves Today for Monday, December 9th, your source of news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby. You can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Crosby Baseball. You can follow the show on Twitter, Braves_today. We have a Facebook page and Instagram as well. And you can find all of my written work, bravestoday.com. That is the Braves Today Substack, as this is both a podcast and a newsletter. And apologies for the mobile setup. I'm still traveling. Apologies for my voice. Turns out Garth Brooks puts on a hell of a show. But while I was traveling, we made a point. Alex Anthopoulos held a Zoom meeting with the Atlanta Braves credentialed media last night to talk about where the team is as we enter the winter meetings, which start this morning in Dallas. So let's talk about what AA said about this team's willingness to spend money, about if they're trying to reset the CBT, why no deals have come together yet, when they expect them to happen, and what they see as the team's biggest needs. And I want to start off with a little bit of logistics here. The way that this works is there was an open Zoom last night to all Braves credentialed media, which Braves Today is on that list, so we were in the Zoom. And we have clips. I have clips to play you from that Zoom. At a certain point in the meeting, the way what the team does for the winter meetings is they ask anybody who is not physically present at the winter meetings to log off. Because in the old days, they used to invite everybody to the team's suite there in the hotel and talk on background. You have a chance to ask questions, get information, all on background. So we're not recording that. We're not playing you clips from that. But now that is something they did via Zoom because, one, Alex isn't in Dallas yet. He's, I guess, expected to arrive either late on Sunday or first thing this morning, but also just try to be more accessible to everybody. But what I want to get into first is some of what came out of that closed portion, because some of the biggest questions people have been about, are the Braves trying to reset the CBT, and what happened? Why did we have to go and non-tender all of these players? Travis d'Arnaud ended up leaving, and what's going on with that? So what Alex told us last night, I think the biggest takeaway that I got from this entire Zoom is the Braves are not afraid of the CBT penalties for going over for a third consecutive season. You'll remember the way this works. The penalties escalate every year on the overage. The third year you're over, it's gone from a 20 or 30% to a 50% tax. If you pay a guy $10 million a year and you are over the tax for the third consecutive year, you also pay $5 million in tax on top of that. Here is Alex's quote on that. Dollars still matter, of course, but it's a tax, right? It's just a percentage for every dollar over. So you're aware of it, but it doesn't stop you from doing anything. So that is Alex's way of telling us they are not insistent that they have to reset the CBT. And I will say, I don't inherently think resetting the CBT is a bad thing. We've seen a lot of teams, including really good teams, do it. The Dodgers did it, I think it was like 2018, 2019, 2020. They were under all 3 years. They were set to reset it again in 2023 until Trevor Bauer's suspension was modified on appeal and some of his salary was put back on the team's roster. And you'll remember they won a World Series in 2020. And so it's almost everybody resets the CBT. The concept of that is not inherently a bad thing. The trade-off here is what do you lose in the year that you are not being aggressive with spending to replace free agents, replace injured players and things like that. And those injured players did play a significant role for the Braves in their approach to this offseason. That's a big thing as well, is we saw the Jorge Soler trade was really always destined to happen because you learned late in the year last year, ask Chris Sale if you want specifics on this, but you learned last year down the stretch that he's not really playable on an everyday basis in the outfield. Especially if you consider you would have had Soler in one corner and you would have had Acuna coming off of a knee injury and probably with some reduced range in the other corner. It's a lot of work Michael Harris has to do to keep the outfield defense respectable. So here's the timeline of everything that happened with the team's thinking. We did get clarity on this from Alex as well. If you remember, we told you, we played clips for you talking to Alex Anthopoulos on Friday after the Braves were eliminated by the Padres on Wednesday, right? They played the doubleheader against the Mets on Monday. They flew to San Diego. They played Tuesday and Wednesday. They were eliminated Wednesday night. And we met with him and Brian Snitker on Friday. So day and a half into the offseason, they had ideas of what they were going to do, but they hadn't done all of the sit down, look at everything, and things could change, right? He told us they expected to pick up the Aaron Bummer option, the Marcell Ozuna option, and the Travis d'Arnaud option. They ended up later declining Travis d'Arnaud. And we got clarity on that whole process last night. It's not because of the early exit in the postseason. They are not shaking things up. It's nothing like that. So towards the end of the World Series, the team found out that their original concept of a plan for the offseason, not in stone, but a rough draft, a rough sketch of what they wanted to do, was going to need to change because of the medical reports on Spencer Strider, Ronald Acuna Jr., and Joe Jimenez. So the team doctors said neither Acuna nor Strider would be ready for opening day. They said, and Alex hinted at this, it could be into May before both players are back, right? That 4 to 6 week time frame that you've heard from Mark Bowman, you've heard from David O'Brien, that is where that came from, is the idea they could be out well into May. At the same time, the Braves got the news after Joe Jimenez was having his, what they thought was going to be a minor knee issue, his minor knee surgery, ended up being major, and he could potentially miss all of 2025, right? So now you're in a situation where you knew you were going to have a void in the rotation. The Braves knew this, right? Max Fried, Charlie Morton, both free agents. But if you thought that Spencer Strider would have been back close to opening day or for opening day, you could have seen a world where Atlanta said, we know we have the core four going into the season. We have Chris Sale, we have Ronaldo Lopez, we have Peter Stolenbach, we have Spencer Strider. We don't need to be as aggressive in the rotation as you would think, despite losing both Charlie Morton and Max Fried. But not knowing that Strider would not be ready for opening day and not knowing when he would be back absolutely means they realized they needed to have a little more financial flexibility. Same thing with Ronald Acuna Jr., not having him for a month. I fully believe Ramon Laureano may have just been kept. If Ronald was not expected to miss time or miss significant time in 2025, it's entirely possible you just keep Ramon Laureano at $6 million. And him and Kelnick are your platoon in the outfield once Ronald's back. But Alex he directly addressed this. And here is what he told us. Quote, that had a huge impact because early in the offseason, you try to get as much clarity as you can. You know who the free agents are going to be. You don't really know what the trade market's going to be yet, and it's still early. Teams are still going through staffing and so on. You have a general idea of some guys that might get moved, but you need a little more time. And what we didn't want to do was lock into all of these financial commitments. And then there's a bunch of opportunities that present themselves and we can't move on them because we made too many commitments elsewhere. So that absolutely had a major impact on us. and we had to act accordingly. It's entirely, if it wasn't for that couple days around the end of the World Series, it's entirely possible that they may have kept all of those players except maybe for Soler. But it turns out the goal was to free up as much money as possible so that they had the flexibility to do whatever came up in the offseason, right? Maybe it's a trade for a guy with the salary that they need to absorb, a Jordan Montgomery from the Arizona Diamondbacks, for instance. Maybe it's a signing. Like, they wanted to have the financial flexibility. Because of that, that's why they lost Travis d'Arnaud. That's why they had to let Ramon Laureano walk. He could still come back at a lower salary. We'll see what his market looks like. The outfield market's done a lot of stuff in the last day or two between Juan Soto, Michael Conforto, and we'll talk about all of this probably on tomorrow's show, unless something huge happens at the winter meetings today. But the other thing here is just understanding that this team is not necessarily afraid of getting into the tax for a third consecutive year. Now, it does feel like there are and Alex's thoughts on the tax. Here's what he said. I said that the tax and things like that, it's just a math equation. It's just dollars spent. You have X amount of money to spend. He's not telling us the exact amount, obviously. You'll bake it in, and that's part of our total spend. Whether it's the first, second, or third time, he's talking about going over the CBT threshold. Obviously, the tax rates go up first tier, second tier, third tier, and so on. You just account for it. And this is consistent with what we've heard from Alex Anthopoulos for years now. His focus is on the cash payroll. They are cognizant of the tax from the perspective of, we need to know what it is so we can account for it in our total spend. But their focus is, what is the cash payroll out the door in any given season? Now, I think there's some questions about where the Braves are going to use that money, why they haven't done it yet, and their time frame for getting something done. And we'll break all that down next, right here on Braves Today. Welcome back to Braves Today. Lindsay Crosby talking about Alex Anthopoulos' press conference to kick off the winter meetings and what this means for the Atlanta Braves. And I think the big thing to know going just right now is that they are trying to make a move. They've had conversations. They've checked in on guys. It just hasn't come together yet. And we actually have a clip from Alex Anthopoulos explaining that.
There's obviously a lot of good players, both free agency and trade. We haven't been able to, get anything done right now in terms of things that we think work for us. But no, there's no shortage of players right now in terms of for the areas we'd like to address. Or it's just a matter of trying to line up on trades and signings, which that's the nature of every offseason, right? So, and a lot of times we've been pretty aggressive early, and we just haven't been able to line up on anything. So one thing we don't want to do is force a deal, but we'll see how obviously these next few days go in Dallas, see if there's more action, more activity. But it's been active, even more active, I'd say, the last day or two. A lot more calls, a lot more dialogue.
So I think the big thing to hear in there is line up on deals. What that tells me, just having covered this team for a while, I've been talking to Alex Anthopoulos, is the prices aren't quite right. Teams are still asking for too much via trade. Free agents are still asking for more than Atlanta wants to spend in free agency. And this is how Alex works, right? We've seen this the last couple off seasons. Last offseason is a great example. By the winter meetings, they had already signed Ronaldo Lopez. Like they made that deal early after re-signing Joe Jimenez and Pierce Johnson. And then winter, they trade for Jared Kelenic right before the winter meetings, and then they're quiet, right? They do make the Chris Sale deal in late December. That comes through with the Red Sox then. And then a lot of their other signings are towards spring training, if not in spring. Adam Duvall's in spring training because prices had come down as you got closer to the season. This is how this team works. They have an idea of how much they want to spend on whatever specific players that they are targeting. And you heard him say, we don't want to force a deal. we don't want to make a deal for the sake of making a deal. They still maintain these are the values we're looking for. This is what we're willing to pay in either prospects or in cash, in salary. But they're not going to force a deal. Now, that being said, Alex did point out that they've had more conversations recently. I would assume that is Willy Adames is off the board at shortstop. You have more clarity now on what the rest of that market looks like. Juan Soto is now off the board. You have more clarity as to what the outfield market looks like with that big signing, and a lot of teams that were holding money to try and wait to see if they got Soto or where else can they repurpose that money. And on the trade thing, there was a note from the closed portion of the meeting. Alex is never going to tell us a prospect they're looking to trade. Like, he doesn't like to name names. He doesn't give specifics. He was asked about Max Fried, and he's like, I can't talk about it. But he did acknowledge that they are open to making trades. And the only thing that they're really not comfortable with is they don't want to lose a draft pick, which means signing a qualifying offer player. The quote there, if you're losing draft picks or that kind of stuff, that's where it's an issue. So that's why I've been insistent now all offseason. The Braves are not going to sign a player with a qualifying offer unless it is an obvious upgrade and value. Look at what Willy Adames got from the Giants. It's a larger deal than Atlanta would have wanted to give, and he had a qualifying offer. But that side note doesn't mean they're opposed to giving out a deal to a guy with a qualifying offer. They signed Will Smith. They won a World Series with Will Smith. You could argue that losing that draft pick was worth it, but they haven't done it since then because they want to keep those draft picks. Here's what he said about about trades this offseason. The whole point of the draft is to either get players that hopefully will become major league players or be used to trade for major league players. So if we're using a mechanism that we know will yield major league impact, that's why we've done it. We've given up draft picks. That wouldn't stop us at all. That's what they're there for. And side note, when he says we've given up draft picks, he means he's traded the player. If you trade away a first round draft pick, a player who was taken in the first round, you have given away that pick. He doesn't want to sacrifice a pick for a signing. He is willing to trade a player. You're giving away that draft pick, right? Sure, you're hoping to get the next great young player, but look, we've traded prospects. It's not a concern for us. And the kind of big takeaway on that was coming back to the major league roster, right? If you can make your big league team better, especially the position we're in with where we've got a chance to win at this moment in time with this core, that's always going to be the priority. That other stuff, we're still mindful of long-term and developing, but the big league team will always be the priority, especially with where we are with this core. This is consistent with what Alex Anthopoulos has told us, is that they are not hugging their prospects. They are willing to move guys for the right deal. You'll remember last offseason, the Braves discussed trading for Garrett Crochet, and some fans at Braves Fest asked him about why they didn't do it, and he said it was too expensive. That was a prospect cost. They didn't think that the value was there to trade for Garrett Crochet. Turns out the Braves rotation had the best ERA in baseball last year. So it worked out not trading for Garrett Crochet last year. Different calculus now. Obviously, the White Sox won a lot of position player prospects reportedly in that deal. The Braves don't have a ton to offer, especially if you don't want them to trade Drake Baldwin, which is where I am. And again, Alex did not mention players. He would never mention the actual players that they would be willing to trade to us. He just does not do that, which is smart. He shouldn't do that. But I think one of the big takeaways, too, from this meeting was there is no deadline to make a trade. They are not saying we have to get this deal done by this time, that these things can come together rather quickly. And you heard him at the end of that clip. Calls have increased, conversations have increased in the last couple of days. I personally think that is because Adames being off the board, that is probably the second biggest infield piece off the board. You've seen one of the biggest pitching pieces off the board in Blake Snell. You've now seen the biggest player in the offseason, Juan Soto, off the board. Teams have more clarity on the remaining options. And so now that teams know a better idea of the free agency landscape, both guys left and prices, now trade discussions are starting to heat up. You may see something done at the winter meetings. We don't quite know yet. But what I do think is another thing I want to point out, I have a clip here for this as well, is we've assumed that Atlanta's shopping list is corner outfield, starting pitcher, shortstop, reliever. And Alex indicated to us both in the open and the closed portion of the press conference that they are taking a more holistic approach to improving the roster. Holistic's probably not the right way to word it, but I'll let him explain what they're talking about.
What's the biggest need going into the winter meetings?
You know, we don't look at it as one, if we were one player away, that's a really great roster to have. And I don't know that many clubs can say that. So I think it's just you look at these as windows of opportunities to get better. And yeah, of course, when you have certain guys potentially leaving as free agents, those are obvious areas that you'd like to address. We have internal options with some of those, but we just don't look at it as one specific. I mean, if you think you want a starter and you need a starter, but what if a great opportunity on the position player front comes up? You can still get better, right? It's about scoring more runs than the other team. That could be not allowing fewer runs or scoring more. So we don't really go into it saying we need this. One need is starter. One need is, I hope there comes a day when our roster is complete and we've got 25 spots locked up and we got one last spot we got to fill. And this is that one last piece. But there's just so many places we can get better, especially when you look at all the injuries we've had. Depth is always important as well. So we're open to everything: bullpen, offense, rotation. We've had conversations about all three areas. So relievers, position players, and starters. I mean, trade, free agents, we've engaged in all three. I don't know what we'll come up with by the time the winter's over, but we're open to adding all three.
So Atlanta is looking at every possible avenue towards getting better, right? They're looking at what players can we add, what positions, but they're just looking to find ways to improve. And I think that's the right way to look at this. Now, that being said, Alex did also in the closed portion give us some names of players that they are expecting to take a step up in 2025. I almost said 24 there. In 2025, right? Grant Holmes he will start the season, or he will start spring training in the rotation, fighting for a rotation spot. They're big believers in Grant Holmes. Honestly, I'm a big believer in Grant Holmes, right? We've talked about this a little bit on the show. We'll do a whole show later when some of the more projections come out in the offseason. We'll do a Grant Holmes show where we talk from a movement perspective with all the cool plots and everything, the graphics. And we'll talk about Grant Holmes, but they did reiterate he's going to have a legitimate shot to he's going to have a legitimate chance to earn a rotation spot in spring. Daisabel Hernandez, the flame-throwing reliever, they are looking at him to see if he can earn a setup spot, right? So he will potentially be in the late inning mix for Atlanta. He would be your Joe Jimenez replacement for 2025. Now, he's had some walk issues in the past, in the minors, even a little bit in Atlanta, but he's one of the hardest throwers. He'd be the hardest thrower of the bullpen, and there's a very good opportunity for him to earn a meaningful spot. If you add Daisabel Hernandez to the back end and you combine that with some of the other players that you've added this offseason, and Anoli Paredes, you have Angel Perdomo coming back later in the year, things like that. Do you need to add a reliever? It's entirely possible that they don't go out and sign a guy in free agency because they have a couple internal options that they could make it work. Do they bring back AJ Minter, not knowing when he'll be ready to go from his hip surgery? It's possible. It does feel like of all of the different positions that you can fill without a large external investment, back-end reliever is probably the one that they're most willing to try this offseason. No promises, right? We don't know Daisable Hernandez is going to work out, or if we don't know any of that stuff, but it's likely that's the one that they try. And then in the meantime, you have to find innings in your rotation. And there was a really great, the clip's too long to play here, and we're running out of time anyway, but I have it for later in the week. There was a great quote from Alex about how the organization thinks about pitching that I don't think I've heard him put into words publicly before. And he talked about how innings per start is more valuable and much more and that much more important than it has been in the past, which I think that explains why the team was willing to go over that $22 million threshold for Aaron Nola last offseason, because he's a guy that puts up big innings totals and that is willing, that posts and that puts up innings and starts every year. I think that was really illuminative. And then the other one, keeping the bullpen fresh is critically important. I believe I don't have it in quotes, but I believe that is a quote. Keeping the bullpen fresh is critically important. And he talked about innings from starters, innings from relievers, keeping the bullpen fresh, and using off days and spot starts to keep your rotation fresh as well. I think we're going to see Atlanta go with that not a full 6-man rotation. They're not pulling a Dodgers thing here, but they'll have your 5 men in the rotation, and they will aggressively use off days, spot starts, and things like that, so that pitchers are more often pitching on 5 days of rest versus the traditional 4. It is just safe to assume that is Atlanta's organizational philosophy at this point, because it's hard to argue with what happened last year. It worked incredibly well to have Atlanta's rotation pitching on 5 days of rest. And you could even argue some of your health issues in the rotation, your Max Fried, your Ronaldo Lopez, even Chris Sale, some of those, and this is all anecdotal, but some of those came up when you swapped to more standard rest down the stretch as you had to win every single game. And there's the old argument about every game matters the same in the standings, whether or not it's April or August. But point remains, they obviously think that is the way to go. So we'll expect more of that this year as well. I found those notes important, that they specifically mentioned keeping the bullpen fresh, and he specifically mentioned innings per start is more valuable than ever. So we're going to do a show maybe later this week if the winter meetings are quiet, maybe next week if they're not, about which Braves prospects look like they can best fit into that desire from the Atlanta Braves. Guys who can go deep into games, guys who post, things like that. We'll do that breakdown again, either later this week or next week, depending on what happens from the winter meetings. We're back tomorrow, unless some sort of crazy breaking news happens. I am traveling today, but we'll do our best to get something happens suddenly at the winter meetings. But we're back tomorrow. In the meantime, if you're listening on audio, do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. And if you want, we actually posted the full video from this press conference, the open portion of the press conference, on the YouTube channel last night. So go to YouTube/Braves Today. You can watch Alex talk about this. You can make fun of his internet issues because he had those too. And we'll be back tomorrow on Braves Today.